The moment Tobias Walden rode into Calico Flats on a dying horse and a borrowed saddle, every soul in town looked up from what they were doing and made a silent, unanimous prediction. He would not last the winter, and he certainly would not stay past spring. It was the autumn of 1873, and the New Mexico Territory wore the season like a threadbare coat, all golden and dust-bitten, the cottonwood trees shedding copper leaves along the dry creek bed that ran behind the main road. The town itself was modest, a general store run by a man named Harold Finch who kept his thumb on every scale he owned, a saloon called the Dusty Rose that smelled of sawdust and cheap whiskey, a church whose steeple leaned 5 degrees east from the wind, a livery stable, a post office, and a boarding house operated by Margaret Holt, a widow of 50 years who believed in 3 things above all else: regular rent, quiet evenings, and the absolute certainty that all drifters were trouble. Alice Baker was 24 years old, and she had heard that speech from Margaret more times than she could count, because she worked for the woman keeping the rooms, cooking the morning meals, washing the linens in a cast-iron basin out back while the sun crawled up over the mesa and painted everything the color of rust and honey. Alice was not from Calico Flats originally. She had come 3 years before, following her father, who had come following a rumor about silver, who had died following a rattlesnake bite 6 months after they arrived. She had stayed because she had nowhere else to go and no money to get there, and because, though she would not have admitted it to anyone, there was something about the vast open sky of New Mexico that made her feel that the world was larger than her grief. She had dark brown hair that she pinned up every morning with the same tortoiseshell comb her mother had given her before she passed years before that, and she had gray eyes the color of a sky just before a storm decides whether to break or move on, and she had hands that were roughened from work but graceful in the way she used them, and she had a voice that was quiet but carried further than people expected, the way a single bell can fill a canyon. She was carrying a basket of clean towels up the front steps of the boarding house when Tobias Walden's horse came down the main street at a sad, limping walk. She stopped and watched him. He was not what anyone would call handsome in an obvious way. He was tall in the saddle, but lean in the manner of a man who had missed more meals than he had eaten recently, with dark brown hair grown a little too long, pushed back from his face beneath a hat that had seen better years. He wore a canvas coat the color of the mesa at dusk, and he had a rifle in its scabbard on the saddle's side, and nothing else that she could see in the way of luggage. His face was angular and weathered for a man who was, she would learn later, only 27 years old. His jaw was dark with a week's worth of stubble, and his eyes, even from across the street she could see they were an unusual thing, a deep green-brown, the color of shallow creek water over mossy rock. He stopped his horse in front of the boarding house, which told her he had either asked someone already or simply guessed right by the sign that hung above the porch railing, painted in Margaret's precise hand. "Looking for a room," he said, not to her exactly but toward her because she was the only person on the porch. "Margaret Holt runs this house," Alice said, shifting the basket to her hip. "You would need to speak with her. Are you her?" "No," he looked at her a moment. Not in the way that men sometimes looked at her, the sweeping inventory kind of look that made her feel catalogued rather than seen. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand. "Would you mind telling her I am here?" he said. "My horse needs tending before I need anything else." It was the fact that he thought of the horse first that made Alice go inside and fetch Margaret without another thought. Margaret came to the doorway, wiped her hands on her apron, took one look at the man and his dying horse, and said what she always said when a drifter arrived. $2 a week, meals included, no drinking in the rooms, no cards after 10, and you leave when I say you leave. He did not argue with a single term. He simply said, "Yes, ma'am," and climbed down from the horse with the careful movement of a man whose joints ached from long riding, and led the animal slowly toward the livery stable 2 buildings down. Margaret watched him go, then turned to Alice with the expression she always wore when she had just done something she was not entirely sure was wise. "He will be gone by spring," she said. "They always are." Alice nodded and went back to folding towels. She was right, as it turned out, but she did not know yet what spring would mean. The first weeks of his stay were unremarkable in the way that anything can seem unremarkable before you realize. It was actually the beginning of everything. Tobias Walden paid his rent on time, said good morning at breakfast and nothing more, ate whatever Alice put in front of him without complaint, and spent his days either at the livery stable working with old Pete Hargrave to earn his keep, Pete being short-handed, and Tobias being apparently very good with horses, or sitting on the porch of the boarding house in the evenings, not drinking, not playing cards, just watching the sky go through its evening changes the way some men watch a fire. Alice noticed him watching the sky. She noticed it because she did the same thing most evenings, from the kitchen window or from the back steps while she waited for the water to heat. There was a particular orange that the desert sky turned about 40 minutes after the sun dropped behind the mountains to the west, a deep, burning amber that lasted only a few minutes before the purple came and took it, and Alice had never tried to explain to anyone why she found it so essential to see that color every evening. It would have sounded foolish. But there was Tobias Walden on the porch, watching that same moment every evening as though it were the one fixed point in whatever life he was navigating. She brought him coffee one evening in the first week of October because she was bringing it out for herself anyway and it seemed wasteful not to offer. He looked at the cup for a moment, then at her, as though the gesture had caught him slightly off guard. "Thank you," he said. "You watch the sky every evening," she said, not accusing, just observing. He looked out at the amber light again. "I used to paint," he said after a pause, "a long time ago. I keep thinking about color combinations I cannot reproduce." She had not expected that. She sat down in the other chair, the one that technically nobody sat in, because Margaret had put it there for decorative purposes and frowned on its use. "What kind of painting?" Alice asked. "Landscapes mostly, some portraits." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "My father thought it was a waste of time. He was probably right." "Why probably?" He looked at her then, and the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of where a smile had once lived. "Because here I am," he said, gesturing at everything around them with a tilt of his head, meaning the dust and the borrowed town and the used-up situation of his current existence. "Here you are," Alice agreed, without judgment, just acknowledging the fact of it. They sat in silence after that, watching the amber turn to purple, and it was one of those silences that are not empty but full, the way a room can be full of something that has no name yet. She went inside when the stars began and did not think too much about the conversation. She thought about it quite a lot, actually. In the second week of October, a man named Cass Whitmore rode into Calico Flats and took a room at the Dusty Rose Saloon. Because the saloon had 2 rooms upstairs it rented when the need arose. And Cass Whitmore was the kind of man who preferred his accommodations to come with whiskey on the ground floor. He was thick in the shoulder and thin in the conscience, and he wore 2 guns where most men wore 1, and he had eyes that moved constantly, the way an animal's eyes move when it is in unfamiliar territory, and does not intend to be the one taken by surprise. He came into the boarding house dining room for breakfast 3 mornings running, because he had decided Margaret's cooking was better than the Dusty Rose's, and he paid for the meals separately and minded his manners mostly. But Alice noticed the way he looked at everything in the room, taking inventory, measuring distances, and she noticed especially the way he looked at Tobias Walden. The first morning Tobias was at the table at the same time. Tobias did not look back. He kept his eyes on his plate and ate his eggs and drank his coffee, but something in the set of his shoulders changed. A very slight adjustment, the way a man's body responds to awareness without wanting to announce that awareness to the room. After breakfast, when the other boarders had gone about their days and Alice was clearing the table, Tobias stayed behind to stack the dishes for her, which he had taken to doing without being asked. "Do you know that man?" Alice said quietly. "Whitmore." Tobias stacked a plate carefully on top of another. "Not personally," he said, "but you know of him." He did not answer immediately, and in that pause was the shape of something complicated. "He works for a man named Drace," he said finally. "Cole Drace. He has interests in land across the territory. Whitmore is the kind of man he sends when he wants something done that he does not want attached to his name." Alice looked at him. "And what does Cole Drace want in Calico Flats?" "I honestly do not know," Tobias said, and she believed him, because the honesty in his voice did not have the particular flatness of a lie. "But I intend to keep my distance from Whitmore regardless." She wanted to ask more, but he carried the dishes to the basin and left through the back door in the direction of the livery stable, and she was left with the half-story and the uncomfortable sensation that the comfortable quiet of the past 2 weeks was perhaps only the pause before something began. Cass Whitmore left Calico Flats after 4 days, having apparently found whatever he came looking for, or not found it, and gone elsewhere to look. The tension in Tobias's shoulders eased, and October moved into its second half with the days shortening, and the nights turning cold and brilliant with stars. It was on one of those cold, star-heavy nights that something shifted. Alice had been up late repairing a hem on one of the curtains in the parlor by lamplight, and when she finally set down her needle and stretched her fingers, she saw through the window that the lamp on the porch was still burning, which meant someone was out there, and she had forgotten to bring it in. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and went out to retrieve it, and found Tobias sitting in the dark beyond the lamp's reach, tilted back in his chair with his face turned up to the sky. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her hand on the lamp, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening with his expression. He looked different in the dark, with his hat pushed back and the starlight reaching his features. He looked younger. He looked like someone who had not yet decided what to do with himself but was thinking about it very seriously. "I am sorry," she said, because she felt she had been watching him without permission. "I came for the lamp." "Leave it a few more minutes," he said. "Come look at this." She came and stood at the porch railing and looked up. The Milky Way was tremendous, a great brushstroke of light across the sky that city people never saw and desert people sometimes forgot to be grateful for. "My mother used to say it was a road," Alice said. "That the ones we lost traveled it to get where they were going." "That is a beautiful way to think about it," Tobias said, and his voice was low and careful in the manner of someone handling something that might break. "Do you believe it?" "I believe it makes the sky more bearable to look at after you have lost someone," she said honestly. He was quiet for a moment. "Who did you lose?" "My mother, when I was 17. Then my father 3 years ago." "I am sorry," he said, and it did not sound like the automatic condolence people offered. It sounded like he meant it precisely. "Who did you lose?" She asked because the question was in the air between them already, and she was not afraid of it. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "My younger brother, James, 4 years ago. He was 19. She did not ask how. She just said, "I am sorry," in the same precise way he had, and meant it in the same way, and they stood there together under the brilliant road of stars and did not speak again for a long while. And that silence was the closest thing to perfect company that Alice Baker had felt in 3 years. She brought the lamp inside eventually, and they both went to their respective beds, and in the morning they said good morning over coffee as though nothing had changed. But something had changed. The way things that have been quietly happening in the background sometimes announce themselves all at once. Through the rest of October and into November, the thing between them grew in the particular way things grow when neither party is quite willing to name them yet. Carefully, in the language of small acts and stolen moments and looks that lasted a half-second longer than they needed to. He had taken to helping her carry the water barrels from the well on Tuesday mornings, which was a heavy job Margaret insisted Alice do alone, because Margaret believed in the character-building properties of physical suffering. Alice did not complain about it. because she needed the job and the room. But on the first Tuesday in November, when she went to the well and found Tobias already there with the cart, she felt something warm turn over in her chest that was more than just gratitude. "Margaret will say something," she warned him. "Margaret says something about everything," he replied, and handed her the lighter end of the first barrel. He was not wrong about that. But Margaret said it with slightly less force than Alice expected, which told her something about Margaret's private opinions that Margaret would never have voiced directly. He found a set of paintbrushes in the general store, old ones, left over from some project Harold Finch had abandoned, and he bought them along with a few cakes of watercolor pigment and a cheap sketch pad. And in the evening sometimes, in the dying light, he would make quick, rough sketches of the landscape. He showed them to Alice one evening without being prompted, setting the pad on the porch railing between them and turning through the pages quickly, as though embarrassed by how good they were. They were very good, not in a technically trained way, though the foundations were there, but in the way that certain images carry feeling, the way music carries it, directly into the part of you that does not think about things first. "Tobias," she said, looking at a sketch of the mesa at sunset that he had caught in about 6 lines and 3 washes of color. "Why did you stop?" "Life," he said simply. "That is not an answer," she said. He took the pad back, closed it. "My father had a ranch in Colorado. When James died, there was a falling out over circumstances, over things that happened. I left." He looked at the mesa. "I have been leaving since then." She understood this in her bones. She had done her own version of it, not geographically, because she had stayed in one place, but internally, the way a person can keep leaving a grief that keeps catching up. "Are you still leaving?" she asked. He looked at her, and the green-brown eyes were very direct. "I am not sure," he said. "It is the first time in 4 years I have not been certain I was." She did not say anything to that because she did not know what to say that would not be too much or too little. And she went inside and stood in the kitchen for a long time, breathing carefully, before she went about her evening work. In the second week of November, a thing happened that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with character. And it was this. Harold Finch was caught shorting payments to the family of a Navajo man named Runs with Thunder, who had sold him a significant quantity of turquoise. The amount involved was substantial, and Finch had apparently been doing it over several transactions across 2 years, and the matter came to a head when Runs with Thunder arrived at the store with 2 of his brothers and asked for a full accounting. The situation turned ugly in the way that too many situations between white merchants and native people turned ugly in the territory in 1873, with Finch calling for the sheriff, and the sheriff, a man named Grady who had the moral backbone of Old Rope, seeming more inclined to side with the store owner than to look at the actual numbers. Alice saw this from across the street and felt the injustice of it like a hand pressing on her sternum. She had seen Runs with Thunder in the store a dozen times. He was a dignified man who spoke careful English and dealt fairly with everyone, and the idea that Finch was stealing from him while hiding behind a veneer of paperwork was infuriating. It was Tobias who stepped into it. He walked across the street to where Sheriff Grady was positioning himself between the Finch and the 3 Navajo men, and he said, quietly but clearly, that he had some experience with bookkeeping from his father's ranch, and he would be glad to help count through the ledger if that would clarify matters. He said it politely enough that Grady could not refuse without looking like he was afraid of arithmetic, which he was, because the accounting was genuinely the problem. Tobias spent 2 hours in the store going through Finch's ledger while everyone waited outside, and when he came out, he had the numbers written on a page in his precise, careful hand, and they showed clearly that Finch owed Runs with Thunder $43. Finch turned the color of spoiled milk and paid it, and Grady found somewhere else to be very quickly, and Runs with Thunder shook Tobias's hand with the gravity of a man who was not often treated fairly in a formal setting, and appreciated it enormously when he was. Alice watched all of this from across the street and felt something shift in her chest that was larger than what had been shifting there before. It was one thing to find a man's eyes beautiful and his company warm. It was another to watch him do the right thing when it would have been so easy, so perfectly ordinary and unremarkable, to do nothing at all. That evening, she put an extra piece of the apple pie on his dinner plate without saying why. He looked at it, then at her, and he understood, and that understanding between them, the fact that they had developed a private language made of small gestures, and the particular quality of silence felt like something she wanted to protect. December arrived and the temperature at night dropped sharply, and the boarding house smelled of wood smoke and pine resin, and Margaret's perpetual pot of something on the back of the stove. Christmas decorations went up in the windows of the establishments along the main street, modest things, bits of evergreen and red ribbon, and the town had a quality of trying very hard to be cheerful that Alice found touching rather than false. Margaret hosted a small Christmas gathering on the evening of December 24th for the current boarders, which besides Tobias included a traveling schoolteacher named George Platt, who was headed for a posting in Santa Fe, and an older gentleman named Mr. Fenwick, who had retired from dentistry and was looking for somewhere warm to be old in. Margaret made a game hen and potatoes and a ginger cake, and there was cider that was just a very slight bit fermented, which Margaret chose not to acknowledge. George Platt had a very good singing voice and knew several carols, and in the warmth and lamplight of the parlor with the small fire going, Alice found herself feeling something she had not felt in a long time, the sense that she was, in some modest but genuine way, home. She sat across the parlor from Tobias and caught his eye over the rim of her cider cup, and he held her gaze a beat too long, and the warmth in the room suddenly had nothing to do with the fire. After the gathering wound down and Mr. Fenwick retired and George Platt went upstairs to write in his journal, Margaret washed up the dishes and made pointed comments about how it was not appropriate for young women to be staying up late in the parlor, and went to bed, and Alice was left to bank the fire. She was crouching in front of the fireplace, arranging the embers, when Tobias came back downstairs. He had forgotten his sketchbook on the side table, but he stood in the doorway a moment without picking it up, watching her. "Merry Christmas, Alice," he said. She looked over her shoulder at him. The firelight was doing something remarkable to the room, making everything amber and soft. "Merry Christmas, Tobias." He came and crouched beside her at the fireplace, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm near hers. He picked up the poker and turned the log she had been struggling with, and the fire caught again properly, and they both watched it for a moment. "I made you something," he said, and reached into his coat pocket and produced a small paper, folded carefully. He held it out. She took it and unfolded it, and it was a watercolor sketch, her from behind looking out at the sunset from the back steps, with the mesa in the distance and that particular amber in the sky. He had caught something in the shape of her that she recognized as true, the way she stood when she was not performing anything for anyone, just being herself in the quiet. She held it for a long moment without speaking, because she was afraid that anything she said would be insufficient for what she felt looking at it. "You see me," she finally said, very quietly. "I do," he said, equally quiet. She turned and looked at him, and they were very close in the firelight, and everything that had been quietly building since October was present in the small space between them, and she thought he might say something more, or do something more, but instead he simply looked at her with those creekwater eyes and said, "Good night, Alice," in a voice that made the two words carry the weight of everything he hadn't said, and stood and took his sketchbook and went upstairs. She sat by the dying fire for a long time after that, holding the small painting of herself. January in New Mexico was a thing that happened to you rather than a thing you could prepare for. The cold came off the mountains like a verdict, and the wind had a personality that was distinctly unsympathetic, and the road through Calico Flats was sometimes mud, and sometimes ice, and sometimes both, and the days were short and clear, and so blue it almost hurt. George Platt left in the first week of January for his posting in Santa Fe. Mr. Fenwick decided the climate was not, in fact, warm enough for his aging bones and departed for Tucson on the stage. This left Tobias and Alice and Margaret, and the boarding house felt at once smaller and larger, and the mealtimes had a quality of intimacy that Margaret addressed by talking more than she usually did, covering the silence with commentary on weather, prices, and the theological failings of various neighbors. Alice and Tobias settled into the winter with a naturalness that neither of them quite acknowledged. He fixed a loose board on the back stairs that had been loose since summer without being asked. She brought coffee to the stable on mornings when he had stayed late to tend to a horse that was having a difficult night, because Pete Hargrave had a bad knee in winter and could not always get there himself. These were small things, individually unremarkable, but they had the cumulative weight of a life being quietly shared. One afternoon in mid-January, when a brief and unusual light snow had come and powdered the mesa white, Tobias took his sketchbook to the creek bed, and Alice, whose afternoon was free because Margaret had gone to visit a friend in a neighboring town, followed him on an impulse that she did not examine too closely. He was sitting on a flat rock above the frozen edges of the creek, drawing the mesa with the snow on it, and he looked up when he heard her boots on the frozen ground and made room on the rock without comment, as though he had expected her. She sat beside him and watched his hand move across the paper. He drew quickly, with confidence, and the lines were sure and economic. He did not second-guess himself on paper. "Are you always this certain?" she asked, watching the brush lay down a wash of blue-gray. "On paper," he said, "and off paper." He was quiet for a moment, his brush lifting from the page. He looked at the mesa, white and enormous against the winter sky. "Alice," he said, and her name in his mouth had a particular weight that it had been acquiring for weeks without her being able to prevent it. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," she said. "What do you want? Not from today, not from the immediate circumstance. What do you actually want from your life?" The question was so direct and so genuine that she felt it in her chest before she felt it in her mind. No one had asked her that, not in years. People asked her what she could do, what she would do, what was practical, what was available, not what she wanted. She thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. The snow-quiet mesa waited. "I want to not be afraid of wanting things," she said finally. "I think I stopped wanting specific things when my father died because every time I wanted something it went away. But that is not a way to live. I know that. She paused. "I want to be somewhere that feels like mine. I want mornings and evenings that belong to me, not just to whoever needs something from me. She stopped again. "Go on," he said very quietly. "I want someone who sees me the way that painting sees me," she said. "Not what I can do, who I am." He set the sketchbook down and turned to look at her. The snow light was very pure and even, and his eyes in that light were extraordinarily clear. "I see you," he said. "I have been seeing you since I came to this town, and I want you to know that I have never once thought of you as what you can do. I think you are the most—" He stopped himself, recalibrated, started again. "I think you are unlike anyone I have met, and I am aware that I am a man with nothing to offer anyone at present, which is why I have not said any of this before, because it would not be fair." "I did not ask for an offer," Alice said. "I just wanted you to know what I want." He looked at her for a long moment, and then very carefully, in the deliberate way he did most things, he reached out and took her hand where it rested on her knee. He turned it over and held it, his thumb tracing the roughened knuckles with something that was both tender and matter-of-fact, as though holding her hand was something he had been doing for years and had simply never confirmed out loud. They sat like that in the snowlight beside the frozen creek for a long time, and it was the simplest and most tremendous thing that had happened to Alice in as long as she could remember. They did not kiss that day. But something had been said that could not be unsaid, and from that afternoon on, the nature of what existed between them was different, still quiet, still careful, but no longer pretending to be something smaller than it was. February came with the wind. The long, sustained territorial wind that blew for days and rattled the boarding house windows and filled every crack and crevice with fine red dust. Margaret caulked windows and complained at volume, and Alice beat rugs in the protected space behind the livery and tried not to inhale, and Tobias took care of the horses, who were miserable in the wind, and at the end of the long, blustery days they would sit at the kitchen table after Margaret had gone to bed and drink tea and talk. They talked about everything. About his family in Colorado, a complicated picture, a father who was formidable and cold, a mother who had been warm before she died when Tobias was 15, a brother James who had been luminous and reckless, and who had ridden out one night in pursuit of a thrill and had not come back from it, and the grief and the guilt and the fracture with his father over decisions made in the aftermath that Tobias did not think he had made wrongly but could not entirely be sure of. About her own family, her mother's laugh in her garden, her father's relentless optimism about silver mines, and the way he could tell a story about bad luck so charmingly that you did not quite realize until afterward that the luck had been entirely bad. About the world beyond Calico Flats, which they both carried in them the way you carry a country you have been to. You know what it feels like under your feet, but you cannot always describe it to someone who hasn't been there. He asked her once what she would do if she could do anything. Teach, she said, without much hesitation. Children, somewhere they needed a teacher and did not have one. I like explaining things. I like the moment when something becomes clear to someone, you can see it happen on their face. You would be extraordinary at that, he said, and she heard no flattery in it, just an assessment he found obvious. What would you do? She asked. He was quiet a moment, his hands wrapped around his teacup. I would paint, he said, not as a luxury, as a life, landscapes. The places nobody is painting because they cannot easily get there. He looked at the window, at the wind-driven dark outside. I used to think it was an impractical dream. I am starting to think impractical dreams are the only kind worth having. She looked at him across the table and felt something so tender and certain that it almost frightened her. On a night in the last week of February, when the wind had finally stopped and left the world outside glass-still and very cold and very clear, Tobias walked Alice to the back door of the boarding house after they had been standing at the fence watching the stars for half an hour, and he stopped her with a hand on her arm. And when she turned, he was very close, and he looked at her for a moment with that considering directness he brought to everything, and then he kissed her. It was not tentative, the way first kisses sometimes are, uncertain of their welcome. It was careful but certain, the way he drew his lines, and it was warm and thorough and left no part of the situation ambiguous. She kissed him back with everything she had been managing for 4 months, and for a long moment the cold night and the stars and the adobe walls of Calico Flats and everything else that constituted the circumstances of their lives fell completely away. And there was just this, just the two of them, just this warmth, just the certainty of something true. When they separated, she had both hands on the front of his coat and he had his forehead against hers, and they were both breathing carefully. I know I am a drifter, he said. I know you know that. And I know what that means for what I can honestly offer a person, but I want you to know that this, what I feel for you, is the most grounded thing in my life. It is the first thing in 4 years that has felt like it belongs somewhere. Tobias, she said, I am not afraid of what you are. I am only afraid of what you might become afraid of. He pulled back enough to look at her. What does that mean? It means I know you have been leaving for 4 years, she said. And I am not asking you to stop on my account. But I need to know whether you are someone who is capable of staying when staying is what is right, or whether the leaving is who you are now. It was perhaps the most honest and the most frightening thing she had ever said to anyone, and the vulnerability of it sat in the cold air between them like something visible. He looked at her for a long time. I do not know yet, he said finally, and she respected him enormously for not lying. All right, she said, then we will find out. March came, and with it the first suggestions of warmth, not real warmth yet, but the memory of it, The way the afternoon light began to linger a few minutes longer each day, and the dried grass along the creek bed showed the first uncertain green at the root. The territory was waking up, slowly and with the typical suspicion of a place that knew how fast the season could reverse. Cass Whitmore came back. He rode in on a different horse this time, a good one, a big bay with the look of money about it, and he did not stay at the saloon. He went directly to the boarding house and asked for a room, and Margaret, who did not know what Alice knew about him, gave him one. Alice told Tobias that evening. Tobias had gone, very still in the way he did, when he was working something through. He stood in the stable doorway with a brush in his hand, and the big bay horse Whitmore's horse visible in the stall behind him, because of course Whitmore had put the horse in Pete's livery, which was Tobias's territory. He would not come back for nothing, Tobias said. What is Cole Drace interested in? Alice asked. Land, you said. Land, water rights. The railroad is coming through the territory in the next few years. Everyone in the territory knows that. Whoever controls certain parcels of land when the survey is finalized will make a significant fortune. He looked at the horse. Calico Flats is on the likely route, which means the land around here is worth considerably more than it appears to be worth right now to anyone who does not know what is coming. He set the brush down. And Harold Finch owns 3 parcels east of town that he has been trying to sell for a year because he thinks they are worth nothing. Alice felt the shape of it settle into clarity. Drace wants to buy them before Finch knows about the railroad. And Whitmore is here to make sure that goes smoothly, or to address complications if it does not. He looked at her. I do not want you involved in this, Alice. I am already involved, she said. I live there. Whitmore lives in the same house I do. He rubbed a hand over his face. I know. Moreover, she said, Harold Finch stole from Runs with Thunder and he is a dishonest man, but he does not deserve to be swindled out of land by someone who knows something he does not. Tobias looked at her with something in his eyes that was frustration and admiration in equal measure. No, he said, he does not. So someone should tell him, she said. The silence that followed was meaningful. That would mean telling him where the information came from, Tobias said carefully. Yes, she agreed. And if Whitmore finds out that I was the one who spoiled the arrangement, I know, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You know I would handle it, he said, if it came to that. I know, she said, but I would rather it not come to that. Tobias, just tell Finch, quietly, man to man, let him make his own decisions. He does not have to know your source specifically. She watched him think about it. She watched him weigh things she could not fully see, the risk, the principle, the man he was, and the man he had been trying to decide whether to still be. All right, he said. He told Harold Finch the next morning in the store early before Whitmore was awake. He did not explain how he knew about the railroad survey, only that he did, and that the land east of town was going to be worth looking at carefully before agreeing to any sales. Finch was a man who would do anything for money, but he was also a man who hated being taken advantage of above all things, which was a moral position of limited coherence given his own behavior, but it was at least useful in this instance. He received the information with the wide-eyed stillness of a man doing rapid arithmetic and thanked Tobias through a tight mouth. Cass Whitmore, when he discovered that his negotiations with Finch had suddenly stalled, and that Finch was now asking questions about railroad surveys, was not pleased. He did not know exactly what had happened, but he was not stupid, and Tobias Walden was the only new variable in the equation. He found Tobias at the livery stable on a cold, bright March morning, and told him plainly that it would be better for his health if he had not done whatever he had done, if indeed he had done anything, which Whitmore had no way of confirming but was expressing as a strong suspicion. Tobias listened to all of this without moving from where he was standing, which was on the correct side of a mucking fork, and said, very calmly, that he did not know what Whitmore was referring to, but that if Whitmore would like to lodge a formal complaint with Sheriff Grady, he was welcome to do so, and in the meantime he had work to finish. Whitmore looked at him for a long time with those constantly moving eyes. Then he said, You should think about whether Calico Flats is a town that suits you, Walden, and left. Alice heard about this from Pete Hargrave, who had witnessed it from inside the stable with great interest. She found Tobias afterward, and he was calm, not the performed calm of someone suppressing fear, but genuine, like a man who had made a calculation, and arrived at a comfortable reckoning with the result. "He will leave," Tobias said. "Without the deal with Finch there is nothing for him here, and Drace does not pay men to sit around." He paused. "I am more concerned about the next town, or the one after. This is what he does. Someone will sell to him without knowing." "You cannot protect every town in the territory," Alice said. "No," he agreed. "But I could write a letter to the Territorial Land Office about the survey manipulation and the practice of buying land based on non-public information. It would not stop everything, but it would put the matter on record." She looked at him. "That is not nothing," she said. "No," he said. "It is not nothing." He wrote the letter that evening at the kitchen table, in his careful hand, while Alice hemmed a pillowcase beside the lamp. And the domesticity of the scene, two people at a table in lamplight doing small, important things, was something she held very quietly in her chest without examining it too closely, because it seemed too good to examine directly yet. Whitmore was gone by the end of the week. He left on his bay horse without ceremony, and the boarding house resumed its quiet, and March moved into its later half with the green along the creek bed becoming more confident, and the days lengthening in earnest. Alice had been told, by almost everyone she respected, that Tobias Walden would be gone by spring. Margaret had said it with the certainty of long experience. Pete Hargrave had said it with the cheerful fatalism of a man who expected very little of the human race and was rarely disappointed. Even the schoolteacher George Platt, who had stayed only a few weeks, had said it with genuine sympathy the night he left. "He's a good man, Miss Baker, but he is a drifter, and they always move with the warm." She had believed it in the beginning. She had calibrated her feelings accordingly, keeping them at what she thought was a safe distance, which had turned out to be no distance at all because, by the time she realized she was not keeping her distance, they were already fully in it together. Spring arrived in the last days of March, not dramatically but gently, the way the best things tend to happen, a warmth in the midday sun, a red-winged blackbird on the fence post behind the kitchen, the first wildflowers along the western edge of the creek in colors that seemed almost embarrassingly optimistic after the long brown of winter. She was out on the back steps one morning with her coffee when Tobias came around the side of the building from the stable direction, his coat off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow in acknowledgment of the morning's warmth. He had his sketchbook under his arm, and he was looking at the sky with the expression he wore when he was already painting something in his mind before he put it on paper. He stopped when he saw her. She looked at him. "Margaret says the stage comes through on Thursday," he said. Thursday was 3 days away. Alice set her coffee cup down on the step beside her with a steadiness that cost her something. "I know," she said. He came and sat down beside her on the steps, close enough that their arms touched. He did not open the sketchbook. He looked at the wildflowers along the fence line for a long moment. "I have been thinking," he said. "I know," she said again. "I do not want to leave," he said. "That is the truth. I want you to know that the wanting to leave that I have been living with for 4 years, it is not here right now. It has been gone for a while, and I did not want to tell you until I was sure it was not just coming back around." She looked at him. "And you are sure?" "I am sure," he said. "But I also know that Calico Flats is not." He paused, searching. "Alice, I have no home here. I work Pete Hargrave's stable for room money, and that is not a foundation I can build anything on. Not for myself, not for anything more. And I have been thinking about what you said in January, about teaching, about going somewhere that needed you." She felt something both wonderful and terrifying begin to open in her chest. "There is a town," he said, "called Mora, northeast of here, up in the mountains. I heard about it from a man who passed through last month. It is a proper town, growing. It has a school that needs a teacher because the last one left." and it has a livery and horse trading operation that needs a manager, and Pete Hargrave wrote me a recommendation because he is a generous man and he knows what he has seen." He paused again. "I looked into it. Both things are real and both positions are available." Alice was very still. "I'm not asking you to go somewhere with me because I want you to follow me," he said, looking at her directly. "I am asking you whether there is a future in which we both go somewhere because we both choose it. Whether what we have is something you want to carry with you into a life that is actually ours, not borrowed." She looked at his face in the spring morning light, the angular, honest face that she knew now as well as she knew the sky above the mesa, and she thought about all the ways she had tried to be cautious, all the careful distances she had tried to maintain, and she thought about her father's optimism, and how it had not always served him well but how the lack of it would have served him worse. And she thought about the road of stars her mother had described, all the ones they had lost traveling somewhere they were needed. "Yes," she said. He looked at her as though he wanted to be absolutely certain. "Alice." "Yes," she said again, more firmly, with the full weight of herself behind it. "Yes, Tobias. I want a life that is ours. I want Mora and the school, and I want you and the sketchbooks and the evenings watching the sky. All of it. Yes." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they sat on the back steps of Margaret Holt's boarding house in the first real warmth of spring and said nothing for a long time, because nothing needed saying. The conversation with Margaret was, as expected, not simple. Margaret received the news that Alice was leaving with a face that went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, displeasure, assessment, a very brief moment of what appeared to be genuine emotion quickly suppressed, and then a dignified settling into practical concern. "You have known this man since October," she said. "I have," Alice said, "and I know him better than I have known most people in my life. He is a drifter." "He was," Alice said. "People change, Margaret. You have told me yourself that this town needs to stop assuming it knows the end of every story before the middle is done." Margaret had, in fact, said something to that effect once in a completely different context, but she acknowledged it with a small tightening of the lips that was as close as she came to conceding a point. "You do not have to go," Margaret said more quietly. "You have a place here." "I know," Alice said gently, "and I am grateful for it. You have been kinder to me than you pretend to be, and I will not forget it." Margaret waved a hand as though swatting the sentiment. "You will write," she said, which was not a request. "Every month," Alice promised. On the morning before they were to leave, Tobias having secured their passage on the stage to Las Vegas, New Mexico, from where they could get transport north to Mora, and Alice having packed everything she owned into one trunk and 2 bags, which together were not very much and somehow also everything, Runs with Thunder came to the boarding house. He came on a good horse and brought with him a small leather parcel which he gave to Alice with a formality that she received with equal formality, because she recognized a ceremony when she was in one. Inside the parcel was a piece of turquoise, polished smooth, strung on a braided leather cord. It was a beautiful object, deep blue-green, and she held it carefully. "My family has land near Mora," he said. "It is good country. The people there, some of them are fair and some are not, as it is everywhere, but the land is good." He looked at Tobias, then back at Alice. "May it go well for you," he said. Tobias shook his hand, and Alice thanked him with full sincerity, and he rode back out of town without ceremony, and she put the turquoise cord around her neck where it rested against her collarbone, cool and solid and real. They were married before they left Calico Flats. This had been Tobias's idea, presented to Alice 3 days before their departure with a directness and simplicity that she found entirely consistent with who he was. He had said, sitting across the kitchen table from her on an ordinary evening, "I want to marry you before we leave. Not because I think you require it, and not because I want you to feel that you cannot change your mind about any of this, but because I mean it, and I want to say it in the clearest possible terms. Will you marry me, Alice?" She had said yes immediately, without deliberation, because the deliberation had been happening for months, and she was already entirely certain. The ceremony was performed by the minister of the leaning-steepled church, a man named Reverend Cole, not to be confused with Cole Drace, who was a very different kind of Cole and considerably less trustworthy. On a Tuesday morning, with Margaret as witness and Pete Hargrave as the second witness, Pete having shown up in a clean shirt and with his hat actually in his hands, which everyone recognized as an exceptional effort. Alice wore her best dress, which was a deep blue-gray, the color of the winter sky, and the turquoise cord at her throat, and the tortoiseshell comb in her hair. Tobias wore his cleanest shirt and a vest that Pete had lent him, which was slightly too short but worn with complete dignity. The ceremony was brief and the words were simple, and when Reverend Cole reached the part where Tobias was to say his vows, Tobias took both her hands and said them looking directly at her face, not at the Reverend, not at the room, only at her, as though she were the only fixed point and he was navigating by her. When it was done, and she was Alice Walden, she felt the name settle around her like something she had been expecting for a while without knowing it. Pete Hargrave shook Tobias's hand and kissed Alice on the cheek and said, "Best thing that ever stayed in my stable, not counting the horses." Margaret pressed Alice's hands very tightly for a moment and said nothing, which was the most she could manage without losing her composure, and Alice understood and squeezed back just as tightly. The stage left Calico Flats at 7 in the morning 2 days later, in the first real warmth of April, with the cottonwoods along the creek just beginning their new leaves, and the sky above the mesa that particular blue that Alice would carry with her forever as the color of the word beginning. Tobias loaded the trunk and the bags with Pete's help. Alice stood at the door of the boarding house and looked at the main street of Calico Flats one more time, at the general store and the dusty rows, and the leaning steeple of the church and the well and the flat rock above the frozen creek where they had sat in the January snow, and felt the completeness of one thing and the opening of another, both at once, which is exactly what leaving is supposed to feel like when it is right. She climbed into the stage. Tobias climbed in beside her. The driver's whip cracked and the horses moved and Calico Flats fell back behind them, and Alice turned forward, toward whatever was ahead, and she did not look back again. Mora, New Mexico, sat in a river valley in the mountains northeast of Santa Fe, and it was in the spring of 1874 that Alice and Tobias first saw it. They came over a ridge in the late afternoon, and the valley was below them, green in a way that the desert was not a full, certain green, the green of water and altitude and good soil. And there was a river that caught the afternoon light and threw it back, and fields being prepared for planting, and a town with its buildings laid out along the main road in a way that suggested someone had planned it rather than just accumulated it. Alice pressed her face to the window of the stage and looked at it. "It is beautiful," she said. Tobias looked over her shoulder. "It is," he said. "It is genuinely beautiful." They arrived as the sun was finishing its descent, and the valley was filling with the long shadow of the mountain to the west, and the air had the particular quality of mountain spring evenings, cool and very clean, smelling of pine and river water and the smoke from cooking fires, and Alice breathed it in and felt something in her relax that had been carefully contracted for a long time. The boarding situation in Mora was at a woman named Clara Rodriguez's establishment, which was larger and more comfortable than Margaret's, and Clara was a wide, warm woman of around 50 with black hair streaked through with silver, and a manner of absolute competence that Alice recognized and immediately respected. She gave them a room on the second floor with a window that looked toward the river, and it was a good room, simple and clean, and that first evening as the light failed and the mountains outside the window went dark and quiet, Alice sat on the edge of the bed and felt the reality of everything that had happened settle into her in the most absolute way. Tobias came and sat beside her and took her hand, and they sat in the new room in the new town in the new life, and did not need to say anything at all. The school was small, one room, with 16 children ranging in age from 6 to 13, and it needed not just a teacher but someone willing to patch the roof, replace 2 broken window panes, reorganize the appalling state of the teaching materials, and handle the varying degrees of chaos that 16 children in one room, unsupervised for months, tended to generate. Alice loved it immediately. She presented herself to the town council on her second day in Mora, a body of 3 men who seemed both relieved and slightly surprised to have a qualified teacher arrive, and who gave her the position with minimal negotiation and a salary that was modest but livable. She spent the first week before school resumed setting the room to rights, scrubbing the floors on her hands and knees, organizing the reader books by level, writing the alphabet in her best hand on the long board at the front of the room, and making a curriculum plan that she was very proud of. Tobias, meanwhile, had presented himself to the livery and trading operation, which was run by a man named Samuel Cord, who was overwhelmed and underhanded, and who recognized in Tobias exactly the competent, honest manager he needed. The 2 of them came to an arrangement within a week, and Tobias began what would become a genuinely skilled operation, not just caring for horses but trading in them, identifying quality animals and placing them with the right buyers, which turned out to be something he had a substantial talent for. They moved from Clara's boarding house into a small adobe house at the edge of town that had been sitting empty, which they rented from a local man named Archuleta, who was glad to have tenants who would keep it in order. It had 3 rooms and a small garden plot at the back and a porch facing the mountain, and it was the most modest possible version of a home, and Alice thought it was entirely magnificent. She planted the garden in late April with seeds she had bought at the general store, beans and squash, and some herbs she had recognized in the seed packets, and 1 packet of sunflowers that she put in along the fence because she wanted something taller than everything else. Tobias built a proper table for the main room from timber he got from the mill at the edge of town, and painted it himself, and she put a cloth on it that she had made from material she found at the dry goods store, a blue that reminded her of the winter sky, and the table in the afternoon light was one of the finest things she owned. He had his paints on the windowsill. She had her books on the shelf he built beside the door. They had their evenings on the porch watching the mountains go dark, and their mornings with coffee before the day required them in different directions, and the turquoise cord was always at Alice's throat, and Tobias's sketchbook was always somewhere within reach. The first months in Mora were not without difficulty. There were families in town who were suspicious of newcomers, and some who were suspicious of Alice specifically, a young woman teaching their children without a great deal of visible history behind her. There were children in her classroom who tested every boundary with the creativity that only months of boredom and freedom could produce. There was the matter of the roof, which turned out to require more than patching, and the matter of obtaining funding from the council, which required 3 separate meetings and a written proposal that Alice worked on for a week. But she was steady. She had always been steady, in the way of people who have carried grief and kept going, which builds a kind of endurance that is different from simple toughness. It bends rather than breaks. It is flexible in the manner of good wood. She handled the suspicious families by inviting them to sit in during lessons, which disarmed most of them within a single morning. She handled the difficult children the way she handled most problems, directly, with warmth, establishing the firm and kind rules that children respond to when they are delivered consistently. She got the council to fund the roof by presenting the water damage to the books in specific dollar terms and watching their expressions change. Tobias watched all of this with a steady admiration that he expressed mostly in the quality of his attention, the way he listened when she came home and told him about her day, the specific questions he asked, the complete absence of the dismissive half-attention she had sometimes encountered from men who considered women's concerns decorative rather than real. He was building something too, steadily and without drama. By the end of summer, Cord's livery, which everyone in town had already taken to calling Cord and Walden's, had a reputation in the valley for fair dealing and good horses, and men came from as far as 30 miles away to trade there. In the evenings he painted, not the rough sketches of the Calico Flats days, but real work, full watercolors, oils on board, landscapes of the Mora Valley and the mountains above it that were genuinely accomplished, that had the feeling in them alongside the technique. He hung some in the house and gave some away, and a man from Santa Fe who passed through in June saw the ones in the house and offered to take 2 to show to people he knew who bought art. Tobias looked at Alice across the table when the man left. "That is a ridiculous idea," he said, but he was smiling. "It is a perfectly sensible idea," she said. "You think someone in Santa Fe is going to buy a painting of a mountain from a livery manager in Mora. I think someone in Santa Fe is going to buy a painting of extraordinary quality from an artist who happens to also run a livery," she said precisely. 2 months later, a letter came from the man in Santa Fe, saying that both paintings had sold and enclosing payment that was not extravagant, but was real and legitimate, and made Tobias stand in the main room of their small house, holding the letter for a long time without speaking. Alice came and stood beside him and read over his shoulder, and when she finished, she put her arm around his waist and leaned into him and said nothing, because nothing was necessary. The first Christmas in Mora was a good one. Clara Rodriguez hosted a gathering that included most of the town, and Alice went and felt for the first time in years that the holiday contained genuine warmth rather than performed warmth, because she was among people she knew and was beginning to be known by in return. Tobias came with her and was the kind of social easy and genuine, good at listening, occasionally very funny in the dry, understated way that took people by surprise, and she watched him move through the gathering and felt the particular pleasure of seeing someone you love be themselves in a room full of other people. They walked home through the cold mountain night with their breath clouding in the lamplight from the houses they passed, and the mountains above the valley were dark against a sky full of stars, and she could see the Milky Way clearly, the great road of light. "My mother was right," she said, looking up. He took her hand, gloved but warm. "About the road, about the road." He looked up too. "Hello, James," he said quietly to the sky, and she squeezed his hand hard and did not let go. Spring came back around the calendar, and with it the anniversary of their leaving Calico Flats, and Alice found herself thinking about how much a year could hold when you let it. A new town, a new life, a garden that had produced beyond what she had expected, 16 children who now knew their letters and their figures and who read aloud on Friday afternoons, with a fluency that made her chest ache with something that was entirely positive. A husband who built furniture and painted mountains and held her with a deliberateness that made her feel, every single time, entirely seen. It was in the spring of 1875 that she told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning, before the day had fully started, sitting at the table he had built with the morning coffee between them and the garden visible through the back window, the beans already beginning to push up their first tentative shoots. He looked at her for a long moment after she said it, and then his face did something she had never quite seen it do before. It opened, entirely without the usual careful thoughtfulness, just completely open and unguarded, like a window someone has been standing behind finally pushing the shutters wide. "Alice," he said, and her name in his voice was a kind of prayer. "Yes," she said, smiling. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her face in both his hands and looked at her as though she were the most important thing he had ever been given stewardship of, and kissed her forehead with a deliberateness that was almost reverent. "Are you all right?" he asked. "How do you feel?" "I feel entirely well," she said. "A bit different in the mornings, but well. We need to find a doctor. There is one in town, Dr. Vargas. I have spoken to him before." "Tobias," she said gently. "I know there is a doctor. I will see him." He sat back on his heels and looked at her with an expression that contained joy and terror in the proportions she imagined most people felt at this particular news, and it was so recognizably human and genuine that she loved him with a force that was almost physical. She continued to teach through the summer, because she saw no reason not to, and because the children needed consistency. The school had grown, 2 new families had come to Mora through the spring, bringing 4 more children, and the council had agreed to enlarge the schoolroom by adding a section onto the existing building, which was happening in stages and with a great deal of sawdust. She saw Dr. Vargas, who was a capable and calm man of around 40, and he confirmed what she knew and gave her practical guidance and checked on her monthly through the autumn. Tobias came with her to every appointment, which the doctor found slightly unusual, and Alice found completely consistent. The baby came in January. He was born on a cold, clear January morning with snow on the peaks, and Dr. Vargas present and Tobias right outside the door, because the doctor had asked him to wait there, and he had agreed with visible effort. Clara Rodriguez was there too, experienced in these matters, efficient and warm, and Alice was tired and determined and more herself in that moment than she had ever been, the way certain extremities bring you fully into yourself rather than outside it. When Dr. Vargas put the baby in her arms and she looked at the small, red, fiercely opinionated face of the person she had made, she felt something so tremendous that she could not have contained it if she tried, and she did not try. Tobias was allowed in, and he came to the bedside and looked at the baby and at Alice with the same expression he had worn at the kitchen table when she first told him, the completely open face, the undone composure, and he sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held the boy with the particular careful certainty of a man who intends to do right by everything in his care. "He needs a name," she said. Tobias looked at the baby for a long moment. "James," he said, and his voice was steady and his eyes were bright. "If you agree." "I agree," she said immediately. James Walden made himself known from the very first hour as a person of decided opinions and considerable lung capacity, and he was beautiful in the way all babies are, and additionally, in a particular way that his parents were perhaps not entirely objective about. And he had his father's eyes, that unusual green-brown, and his mother's determined chin, and he was the best thing that had happened in a life that had already accumulated an unexpected number of good things. Letters went out to Margaret Holt and to Pete Hargrave that same week, and Margaret wrote back with a promptness and warmth that she would have been mortified to know was transparent, congratulating them both in terms that were affectionate beneath the proper surface. And Pete sent a brief and enthusiastic note that contained 3 misspellings and an exclamation point after James's name. Life in Mora settled around the child, the way water settles around a new stone in a creek. Everything rearranged slightly to accommodate the new center of gravity, and the rearrangement was welcome and complete. Alice returned to teaching in the autumn, with James going to Clara Rodriguez each day, who had offered with a warmth that brooked no argument, and who taught the boy Spanish alongside everything else, which Alice considered an excellent development. The school had now 20 children, and the enlarged building was finished, and Alice had a teaching assistant 3 mornings a week in the form of a girl named Rosa, 17 years old, who was herself an excellent scholar, and who Alice was quietly and deliberately preparing for a teaching position of her own in a few years. Tobias's painting had grown. The man from Santa Fe had become a reliable conduit, and twice a year Tobias sent down a set of finished pieces that were sold to buyers in Santa Fe and, increasingly, as far as Albuquerque. It was not a fortune, but it was a real and growing income, and there was talk of a proper exhibition, though Tobias viewed that prospect with the wary skepticism of a man who had learned not to trust things before they were solid. The livery was firmly his now. Samuel Cord had retired his active role and taken a smaller share, and the operation was known as Walden's throughout the valley, and young men came to apprentice there with some regularity, and Tobias trained them with the same careful attention he brought to everything, patient and exact and genuinely interested in whether they were learning. It was in the spring of 1877, 3 years after they had come to Mora, in the season that had always been the one people said would end things, that Tobias came home on a Thursday evening and stood in the doorway of the kitchen while Alice was finishing the dishes, and James, who was 2.5 and in possession of very decided locomotion, was pushing a carved wooden horse around the kitchen floor with the single-minded intensity of a tiny person with important work to do. Tobias leaned against the doorframe and watched both of them for a moment, his wife at the basin, his son on the floor, and Alice heard the particular quality of his silence and turned around. He had an expression on his face that she recognized, the painter's expression, the one he wore when he was looking at something he wanted to remember exactly as it was. "What?" she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Nothing," he said, "only this." "Only what?" "This," he said again. "Right now, the two of you in this room." He pushed off the doorframe and came in, stepping over James's horse and its determined operator, and put his arms around her from behind and pressed his face briefly into her hair. "I have been thinking about what I would paint if I could paint anything." "And," she said, leaning back into him. "This," he said quietly. "Exactly this." She turned in his arms so she was facing him, and she put her hands on either side of his face, that angular, honest face she had watched through every season and in every light, and she looked at him the way she had always wanted to be looked at, fully, directly, with complete attention and complete love. "Then paint it," she said. He did. He painted it from memory one evening the following week, not Alice herself, but the scene, the kitchen in the warm lamp light, the small figure of James on the floor with his wooden horse, the suggestion of a woman at the basin, the ordinary miraculous warmth of it all, and it was the best thing he had ever made. When the man from Santa Fe came through that summer, Tobias showed it to him but did not send it. That one stayed on the wall of the house on the edge of Mora, where it hung for many years, and where visitors sometimes stopped and looked at it with the feeling of something they could not quite name, which was the feeling of someone else's happiness being so complete and so genuine that it becomes briefly yours just from proximity. Alice found out she was expecting a second time in the autumn of 1877, and this time she told him at dinner, over the table he had built, with James in his chair managing a spoon with the seriousness of a person who considers eating a competitive sport. Tobias's response was the same in its essential quality as the first time, that completely open face, that immediate tenderness, and different in the way that second things are always different from first things, more settled, more sure of its own ground. The second child was a girl, born in the high summer heat of 1878, and she was smaller than James had been but louder, immediately and decisively louder. And she had Alice's gray eyes and Alice's stubborn chin and Tobias's capacity for a look that communicated a great deal without any words. They named her Clara, for Clara Rodriguez, who had been so unreservedly kind to them from their first evening in Mora that not naming a daughter for her would have been an omission both of them felt equally. Clara Rodriguez herself received the news with an emotional restraint that lasted approximately 30 seconds, before she abandoned it entirely and embraced Alice with a warmth that was itself an entire history of affection. The children grew. James grew into a boy who was quiet and observant the way his father was, with an interest in drawing that he expressed mostly in charcoal lines across every available surface paper, fence boards, the back of a school reader, twice the wall of the kitchen before Alice established a firm policy about walls, and a tenderness with animals that Tobias recognized and took seriously. Bringing James to the livery on Saturday mornings, and teaching him the things that could be taught, and letting the instinctive things reveal themselves naturally. Clara grew into a person of absolute self-possession and strong opinions about everything, who also happened to be an exceptionally quick learner, and who, by the time she was 4, was actually reading, not just recognizing from her mother's simplest reader books. Alice taught her the way she taught all the children, with patience, with challenge, with the fundamental respect for the person's intelligence that is the basis of all good teaching. They were a family. Not a perfect family. There were difficult evenings, disagreements that required working through, the ordinary stresses of money and health and the unpredictable difficulty of life in the territory. But a genuine one, held together not by circumstance but by choice, renewed daily in the small ordinary acts of two people who had looked at each other honestly and decided. Tobias's painting continued to grow in reputation, slowly and without spectacle, in the way that real things tend to grow. By 1880, he had been offered a proper exhibition in Santa Fe, and this time he accepted, and he and Alice went down together for a week, leaving the children with Clara Rodriguez, who was delighted and competent, and fed them quantities of food that Alice later estimated to have exceeded all reasonable measure. The exhibition was at a gallery belonging to a man who dealt in Western art landscapes, portraits, scenes of territorial life, and Tobias's work occupied one wall of the main room and a second room at the back. Alice walked through the exhibition on its opening evening, wearing her best dress, the turquoise cord at her throat, her tortoiseshell comb in her hair, and she looked at her husband's paintings on the walls of a proper gallery in Santa Fe and felt a pride so complete it left no room for anything else. There were people from the city there and from the territory's various towns, and they looked at the paintings and spoke to Tobias with a seriousness and engagement that he received with his characteristic calm, not false modesty, not performance, just the genuine ease of a man who knows what he has done and does not need it confirmed, but receives confirmation graciously. He sold 13 of the 17 pieces over the course of 3 days, but the best moment, the one Alice kept, was the first evening, when the crowd had thinned and the gallery was quieter, and she found him standing in the small back room in front of the painting of the kitchen in Mora, which he had brought as the centerpiece and marked not for sale. He was just looking at it. And she came and stood beside him, and they both looked at it together, that painted kitchen, that small painted James on the floor, that suggested figure at the basin, and she put her hand in his and he held it. "We did all right," she said. He looked at the painting for another moment, and then he looked at her, and his eyes were the same creekwater green-brown they had been on that autumn day in 1873, when he rode a dying horse into Calico Flats, and she was standing on a boarding-house porch with a basket of clean towels. Only now they carried the entire weight of everything that had happened since. All the seasons and the conversations and the shared silences, and the 2 children sleeping at Clara Rodriguez's house, and the school and the livery, and the painted kitchen, and the Milky Way road of stars. "We did considerably better than all right," he said. She wrote to Margaret Holt that winter, the monthly letter she had promised, and kept a promise she had maintained through every change in season, her neatly written pages going out on the stage, and Margaret's more formal but increasingly warm replies coming back. Margaret was aging, and Calico Flats had changed some. Harold Finch had sold 2 of his eastern parcels for a good sum when the railroad survey was officially published, a fact he had attributed entirely to his own business acumen, and which Tobias received with equanimity when Alice relayed it. The sheriff had retired and been replaced by someone, according to Margaret, who was actually competent, which Margaret described as a development that had taken everyone by surprise. Pete Hargrave had passed away in 1879, peacefully, at his livery stable, which everyone in Calico Flats agreed was where he would have chosen. Alice and Tobias had received the news from Margaret and sat together quietly for an evening, raising a cup to a good and generous man. The letter that winter contained the usual things, the news of the town, the weather, a commentary on the theological character of the new minister, and ended with a paragraph that Margaret had clearly written more carefully than the rest, the handwriting being neater and the sentences being shorter, which was Margaret's way of expressing things that mattered. She wrote that she thought often of the morning they had left, and that she had been wrong, not about the drifter leaving. She had been right about that, but about what leaving meant. She had always thought that drifters who left took nothing with them, that leaving was a kind of erasure. But watching Alice leave with Tobias, she had understood that it was possible to leave and take everything with you, every important thing, and build it somewhere new, and that this was not the lesser version of staying that she had always believed. She had found, she wrote, that the letters from Mora had been the best company of her later years, and that she was proud of Alice, and she hoped Alice knew it. Alice read the letter at the kitchen table, and held it against her chest for a while, and felt the completeness of a thing coming full around. Spring arrived in Mora with its customary certainty in 1881, the river running high from the mountain snowmelt, the valley flooding green, the wildflowers along the Mora River coming up in the riotous colors they achieved in good water years. James, who was 6 now, was in his mother's school and was an exceptionally good student, which Alice was scrupulously careful to treat exactly the same as every other student, not easier and not harder. Clara, who was 3, attended certain mornings when she was not entirely manageable at home, and occupied herself mostly by examining everything in the schoolroom with the systematic thoroughness of a natural scientist. Alice stood at the front of her school on a morning in late April and watched her students bent over their slates, the scratch of chalk, the sounds of concentration, the high mountain light coming through the windows. She had replaced herself in the first week, and she felt the particular fullness that she had once said she wanted, the mornings that belonged to her, the work that was genuinely hers, the life that was not borrowed but made. She touched the turquoise cord at her throat. At the livery, Tobias was working with a young apprentice named Eli, 15 years old, who had a gift with horses that Tobias had recognized, and was developing with the same patient investment that had been extended to him, in a different way, by enough people along the road that he had learned to pass it forward. In the evenings they had what they had always had, the porch, the sky, the conversation that had never run out of things to say, and now the children's voices in the house behind them as bedtime was negotiated, and then the quiet when the children slept and the stars came out. Tobias would take Alice's hand on those evenings, the same hand he had first held at the frozen creek in Calico Flats 5 years before, that hand that was strong and work-roughened and entirely itself, and he would hold it with the same deliberateness he brought to everything he valued, and they would watch the mountains go dark against the last of the light. "Tell me something," she said one evening, the way she had always said it, on evenings when the world was quiet enough to invite that kind of conversation. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the darkening peaks. "I think about that first evening," he said, "when you brought me coffee on the porch." "I brought it because I was bringing my own," she said. "I know," he said, "but you brought it anyway. You didn't have to." He turned to look at her. "That was when I knew." Knew what? That I had ridden into the right place. He looked at her with the steady openness that was the essential quality of him when he was being entirely himself. "I did not know yet what I was riding toward, but I knew I had arrived somewhere." She looked back at him in the failing light, at the face she had watched through every season, winter and spring and summer and autumn and winter again, through grief revisited and joy surprised, through ordinary mornings and extraordinary ones, through the years of building a life from the particular raw materials of 2 specific people who had found each other at a cold crossing and decided daily to keep finding each other. Margaret Holt had said with absolute certainty that the drifter would be gone by spring. She had been right. He was gone by spring. He had taken Alice with him. He had taken her to a valley in the mountains where the river ran silver in the morning, and the sky was the same blue that the sky was everywhere, and where her students learned to read, and his horses were traded fairly, and his paintings found walls they belonged on, and their children grew in the particular direction of people who have been well loved. He had taken her to a life that was not borrowed, not contingent, not waiting for someone's departure. He had taken her to a life that was theirs. And she had gone. With her tortoiseshell comb and her turquoise cord and everything she was, she had gone without a backward glance after the first one, because the forward direction had contained all of this. This porch, these mountains, this man beside her in the particular blue hour when the day was done, and the stars were beginning, and everything that mattered was within the sound of her voice. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The Milky Way came out above the mountains, that great luminous road across the dark, the same road that was visible from every point on the earth if you found a sky clear enough to show it, the same road her mother had described, the same road they had stood beneath together on that cold porch in Calico Flats before they knew what they were to each other. "Hello, James," she thought to the sky, the same way he had said it aloud once, and she imagined the road of stars full of everyone they had loved and lost, traveling wherever it was that the road went, and she felt both the weight of that and the lightness of it, the grief and the gratitude existing together the way they always had, the way only real things can coexist without contradiction. "Come inside," she said eventually. "It is getting cold." "In a minute," he said, his eyes still on the stars. She smiled. She had known he would say that. She had known it the way you know the things that are true about the people you have chosen and who have chosen you, not because they are predictable, but because they are known completely and with love in the deepest sense of the word. She stayed beside him for another minute in the cold mountain dark, beneath the road of stars, on the porch of their house, in their life, in their spring.